Let's talk.
John Brown.
Nuremberg. The Nuremberg Trials laid bare the atrocities of the Nazi regime to the world. You will be aware of that because of the recent film, if you weren't a historian. But I'm delighted to say that friend of the show, one of my favourite people to have on this show, is Professor Helen, and I'm delighted to say that she joins me live on the line now, not from somewhere in Nuremberg, but somewhere looking very pastoral and nice. Good morning to you, Helen. How are you?
Good morning. I'm great, and I'm here sat in London and about to talk to you again, which is wonderful.
Well, you know, as you know, one a couple of my favourite things in the world, apart from doing radio, is this strange fascination with the Reich. As I said before, Mum was over there in Germany, sort of post-war and whatever, and it is, you know, people say, why are you interested in the Second World War? It's all generals and it's all been done and dusted. But one of the things about this isn't the Second War. This is, you know, the aftermath and what comes to build, if you like, the modern Europe. So explain a bit about what was your starting point with this, because I mean, many people think they know all about the trial.
Yes, I mean, it's the same with a lot of the Second World War history and the trial itself. There is still material that's being released. And in the case of this particular book, of course, it's about one man, the translator at Nuremberg. He's one of the key characters in this latest Nuremberg film with Russell Crowe. So this is Howard Triest, and he reached out to me, actually. So I've got this eyewitness account of his life because I got this email transatlantic from America saying my friend has said to me that I need to get my story down, and this was about 6 or 7 years ago, how he said, I'm the last surviving eyewitness to what happened in the prison cells at Nuremberg. Now, I'd worked on a lot of the documentation, but he gives us what it was like to be there, and his is a very personal, tragic story as well. So that was the starting point. And Howard said to me, well, are you interested in my story? I see you write about this kind of thing. Will you write the book? And we started this incredible friendship. And I interviewed him for hours and hours. And I'm so glad I did, because his story is so relevant today.
The thing is, when you get a call like that or an email like that, you're pretty pottering around thinking, I'll just do that and maybe I'll go out and, you know, make a cup of tea at like 11 o'clock. And then something like that comes in your inbox. I mean, do you immediately think, stop the press or, you know, get me New York? I mean, how do you, because that is basically Indiana Jones, the temple of documents, isn't it, Helen?
Yeah, I mean, I replied to him straight away. I thought this was very exciting. We set up a phone call. And yeah, I knew as soon as he started talking that this story had to be told. And he'd asked me to be the mouthpiece for that, because I had a platform to be able to publish his story. And it is important, it is significant, because they are touching history. They are the eyewitnesses that you can't reconstruct from files in the National Archives. They give us something special, and the human story, the very personal story of what it was like to be there.
You see,
one of the biggest moments post-World War II, isn't it, the trials? And he was there.
I mean, that's the thing. And also, because we tend to think, if you know, you think Nuremberg, okay, like the film obviously is going to center on Goering, you know, and and the American psychiatrist, but we tend to think in black and white. We think of, you know, Goering glowering behind his, you know, in the dock. We think of them all, you know, all the Nazi quote unquote great and good all lined up in rows. The white helmeted American police, etc. The Russians scowling and thinking, if we had got this lot to Moscow, it would take us 2 seconds to deliver justice. We don't think about the personal stories, because it seems, again, but we tend to think in history as the grand sweep, the grand strategy, not the personal stories. And this is what makes this book so fascinating.
Yeah, in fact, somebody wrote to me recently and said it's the best book I've ever written. Well, I don't know. I try not to judge books and put them in a pecking order. But he said to me that it was just, I couldn't put it down, because it's that the heart of the story really is that Howard, he's in his early 20s. Yeah. He's fled Nazi Germany. He's in the American forces doing some intelligence work with the forward invasion forces, because of his fluency in German. And then he's posted to Nuremberg. And he's posted to the prison, and he's a witness every day behind the scenes. He goes into those prison cells. If anyone's seen the film, he goes into those prison cells with the psychiatrists, and he's their translator of the interview. So this is behind the scenes when those top Nazis, we're talking about the biggest names that have survived the Nazi regime that are on trial, and he sees them as the men that they are. They're not bravado sort of show as in the trial or trying to justify things. And it was fascinating because there were some moments, particularly Goering, he said, even though he was defeated, Goering in his cell, to us, he was a great showman. He showed this sort of power, but he also, these defendants, started to think of Howard and the psychiatrist as their friend or a listening ear. Of course, Howard didn't see it that way, but this was a listening ear because they're in solitary confinement.
Sure.
So it was just a moment that we have, I think, important to understand. And just finally, if I might add to that Howard said to me there were two reasons why we were going into the prison cells. It wasn't to interrogate them, which is what you would automatically think. It wasn't to get any evidence. We had tons of that going on at the trial. We had to make sure, the psychiatrists had to make sure they were physically fit for trial. We're not going to have any nonsense about they're not well enough. So they had to analyse that of all of them. And secondly, this was for the psychiatrists with Howard translating, could they analyse pure evil? How and why had these men been able to commit these horrific atrocities and mass murder of millions? And he said in the end, they never came to an answer. They never found what it was in all of those interviews to explain how these civilized men could have done it.
But that's the thing. That's what fascinates me about the Reich. It's not because it's the monstrosities and the horror, which it is, but it's how a country that's given us Wittgenstein, a country that gives us, Beethoven, Luther, the whole thing suddenly gets this collective madness and just goes so far down that path that nobody, and they get caught up in this collective, as I said before, it's a madness, it's a psychosis almost, and then it's this whole denial thing, which Goering has, and that's, so they're not looking for pure evil, they're not looking for somebody, who's drawing a pentagram on the was doing a Hannibal Lecter impersonation 50 years before Silence of the Lambs. It's the banality of evil, but also the fact that there's some sort of mass psychosis, Helen.
There is, and Howard said, he would go in and sit on the bed next to them because the psychiatrist making notes would sit at the little desk and table. Yeah. And so he was literally within inches of these monsters. And he said, there are days when you went in and they were sat there, sometimes quite quiet. Sometimes they ranted, of course, about whatever was on their mind to the listening ears. And he said they looked, in some cases, like somebody's ordinary grandfather. And he said that was just, he played with his head trying to fathom these giants in Nazi history that had done the most horrific stuff, and yet at the end of the day they were men and they were someone's family, and sometimes they behaved as though they were just ordinary human beings, and it was just bizarre. I mean, what an experience. And of course, as you know from reading the book, Howard, by the time he arrives at Nuremberg, he knows that these men have sent his parents to Auschwitz. They don't even make it in the camp. They are murdered just as they get off the train, they're straight murdered. And he knows that, and he holds it together because he said, I was given this task as a translator to see as part of the justice system. And for him, there was that strong link to seeing justice done, but it wasn't his place to exact it personally by poisoning their drink or something, which he said he could have done in the cell. He went in sometimes on his own, but he said it was not my place to do that. Justice had to be done in front of the world. I mean,
how does he get out of Germany, by the way? How does he, because obviously that was this is, if you like, the even more mind-expanding thing, the fact that he's Jewish. He knows his family have died at Auschwitz. So he gets out from Germany, in the 30s? He's able to get out before, before the travel bans, or if you like, or the anti-Jewish laws are tightened even further. How does he get out of Germany?
Well, they don't get out till quite late. The whole family, his parents and sister, only his sister and one of his grandmothers survives. The whole rest of the family completely murdered. annihilated in the Holocaust. So he comes first, they flee first to Belgium. And then, of course, when Belgium's occupied, they move into France. And eventually the father's rounded up and sent to Camp des Milles, which is not far from Marseille. The mother soon follows. So does Margot. But Howard, they're on the waiting list to go to America or wherever will take them. Yeah. And Howard's number comes up before the others. And he doesn't want to go without them. And they said, no, you must go. Your tickets come up to emigrate. So he emigrates to America, where he's met by an uncle, and eventually he enlists in the American forces. But from Camp des Milles in 1942, his parents are transferred up to Paris, just outside Paris, Camp Drancy. Yeah. Margot has been rescued by a Catholic organisation that has been allowed into the camp, and they've said, right, we'll take some children, and the camp guards allowed them. The parents had a choice to keep the children with them, and some did, and they perished. They allowed Margot to go. That last goodbye was horrific. Yeah. And Margot she's in hiding for 2 or 3 years. She makes her own escape through Switzerland with these tiny Jewish children. Unbelievable. And then, of course, horrendously, in that August of 1942, Howard and Margot's parents are transferred from Camp Drancy straight to Auschwitz. Mm. And there's that last letter, I won't spoil it for the readers, that she pushes through a crack in the train, in the cattle truck as she's going. I mean, unbelievable. You know, it still has the power to make me cry when I read it, all those years after I first saw it.
But it's the humanity. See, this is the thing. History is about, people in history books are not different. There's no difference between the people who are suffering in the Holocaust to the people who are in Sparta. Okay, the dress sense might be a bit different, but you see what I'm saying. So now you would, and with that as a backstory, as the Americans would say, you would think that the first thing if this book had been written by Quentin Tarantino, he would have gone in all gun blazing, Helen. But it's the sense of he knows that this must be done. He wants to, he needs to be the translator. He's the one qualified for it, isn't it? So, I mean, just the strength of character of the man. What was it like to talk to him? I mean, heaven forfend, most of us would be, I never want to see another German as long as I live, But obviously, he lived a full and hopefully bountiful life.
He did, into his 90s, and he was always reflecting. He said, I lived the rest of my life, a civilian life. He had a very happy married life with children, his grandchildren. But he said, I always lived in the shadow of Nuremberg. He could never forget it. It was that life-defining, big, momentous trial. If you're in the trial and part of the translation stuff, to be in the prison every day for a year, going into those prison cells, that is an experience which changes you, and it changed him. And he was very analytical and non-emotional about it. He was very matter-of-fact when he just answered my questions. And I thought, I've interviewed a lot of veterans. Where's the emotion? Where's the trauma? Because I knew it must be there. And I didn't want to spark anything or trigger anything. But when I was comfortable enough, a couple of years later, before the book was finally finished or draft, I asked him, and I won't spoil it for the readers because it is in the book, but I wished in a way I hadn't asked him. Right. Because it was completely what I wouldn't have expected, that how every day there's a simple task he does, which means he cannot forget his parents. Amazing, I
mean, people might just, if you came to this completely without a knowledge of history, you might think the trial of the Nuremberg is all about Göring. But it's not. There are so many other defendants. Obviously, did he meet Hans Frank? Did he meet?
Yes.
Right. I mean, Hans Frank finally doesn't he? He famously gets his kids in. And Nicholas, who is his son, who then became this brilliant anti-Nazi, and says, it's okay, I'll be out by Christmas. And Nicholas Frank says, even Nicholas as a child knows that his father is lying, even at that last moment, doesn't he?
Yes, so all of those top defendants, and Howard goes on later, as part of this whole reconciliation with the past, to meet Nicholas Frank, actually. Wow, okay. And again, that's in the book. And he meets some of his school friends that had joined the Nazi party. Perhaps he argues that they possibly didn't have a choice. So there's all those layers after the war. But yes, he has this extraordinary, relationship's the wrong word, but Julius Streicher, Hitler's sort of chief of propaganda.
Yeah, Streicher, yeah.
thinks that Howard is a typical pure German Aryan because he's got blonde hair and blue eyes. They keep his Jewish background from him. And Stryker says, I can't trust the psychologists. They're Jewish. I'm sure they're Jewish. And he says to Howard, I trust you. You are my, and guess what his phrase was? You are my Aryan friend at Nuremberg. Ooh. And Howard would go in sometimes and Stryker would be sort of bubbly. I mean, sometimes he'd be absolutely ranting and raving, but he'd say, good morning to my Aryan friend at Nuremberg. How are you? That just shows the absolute, the fact how insane this ideology is. But he thought he was a friend, and he said, I've got something to tell you, but I don't want you to, And all this was going on. He had no idea. And he went to the gallows never knowing that, quote unquote, his Aryan friend at Nuremberg was actually a German Jewish refugee that he would have sent to the death camps. I mean, you can't make it up. It's bizarre. This is what he dealt with,
I just need to ask this question because it's this terminology would be wrong, but of all the people who were tried, and Speer is the one that always gets me. I'm fascinated by Speer because he's got, his denial, and if you've read the book, his Battle with the Truth, which is the brilliant biography of him, which is, I'm going to reread actually very, very soon. Did he have meetings with Speer? I mean,
yes.
He, right? This is
all of them.
This is Hitler's minister. This is Hitler's who's originally he's an architect. He's in charge of works. Other people are executed. Speer somehow gets it turns out to be 20 years at Spandau, 30 years when he did, around that. What do you think about Speer? Because I've always been fascinated by Speer.
Yeah, he said ultimately not all of them faced proper justice, and there were still those that were. They were never brought in. The Allies didn't have the resources, the human power, the men and the women that were working on this, gaining the evidence. And for him, that was problematic. But to see those top Nazis, the majority of them, to have due justice was for him important. So he lived to that. He saw that.
Yeah. As a historian, as a brilliant writer, Helen, it's, you bring colour, you bring life to all of your books, but to actually have to write a book when really closely the subject, the actual that must make it. A, it makes it much more satisfying, but B, it must put an awful lot more pressure as a writer on you because you actually have, you know this gentleman, you know Howard,
Well, he read it before, before it was finished. So it's kind of that moment, like, what's he going to think of what I've written? But what I think is really important as historians to do is to listen. And that might sound very simple, but it's not always the case that historians listen. They might kind of hear something and sort of spin a little bit or perhaps sensationalize it. But I do quote him in the book, and you can hear his voice, if you like. You can hear his soul. You can hear his experience through the particular words and how he chooses to explain key moments, including all of those, the whole range of them that he was going daily into the cells and his whole life experience. So I think that's terribly important to use these oral stories. It's a responsibility, but not to misinterpret or to put layers of extra interpretation on his experience. And when I started out 20, 25 years ago, it wasn't popular really to quote veteran testimonies because they could be quote unquote unreliable. But now we've got all the declassified files, not all, but vast majority. You can match his story and events chronologically and historically, and it's very, very, it is close to the actual history.
What are you hoping that people will take from Nuremberg? It's a really, all the stories are fascinating, but this is particularly poignant, resonant. It is one that, stays, I can just see how it's one that's going to stay with you for the rest, for very many years, to put it mildly.
I think it's about, and I don't want this to sound glib or it's about learning the lessons of history. And I think we don't necessarily learn the lessons of history today, look at what was done, look at what was delivered. This is really important. We've got the rise of Holocaust denial on an unprecedented level. And Howard knew that. Howard and I talked about that. He said to me, I know one day, well, it was already happening in his lifetime. And that's why his friend had said to him, you've got to get your story down. Other people will do their stories. So I think to read that human story against this gigantic backdrop of how do we comprehend all of this through his personal story, we understand the cost to his family of this anti-Semitism, this race hatred, and he survived. He survived to go on to fight for the country that had saved his life. He was involved in the fight. He landed on Omaha Beach. He fought for our freedoms and then goes on to be part of delivering justice. And he's an eyewitness to that period. And I think we forget the perils. We forget his story and the lessons at his peril. And that's sort of woven through the book.
And all of those amongst us, who are those worst sort of creatures, i.e. armchair historians who spend many hours poring over through our bookshelves going A to B to C. It's not about dead kings and it's not about boring battles. It is about lessons that we can see and traits that we see even today. Helen, are you doing a book tour? I know you're doing festivals, aren't you, over the summer? Very rock and roll. So where can people find you? Are you going to be doing some live appearances? Is what I'm saying. Not on stage live with Black Sabbath, but you know what I'm saying here.
Yes, well, I'll go live with Black Sabbath if I get the invitation. Okay, I'll go anywhere. Yes, it's brilliant. Yes, I'll go wherever. I'm doing something actually online for a conference in Rome around Nuremberg stuff. There are festivals. I'm at Bradford Festival for History, Literature Festival. I do podcasts, as you know.
Oh, yes.
I'm also very active on Twitter X because I think it's important to use that space for bite-sized pieces of history, to use it for positive, on Instagram. So find me everywhere. And yes, we must keep these stories alive. I think we have to be, and you do it through your show, guardians of history.
Well, I've just been called a guardian of history. I think I might just cry. The book is called Nuremberg, the Translator's Tale. It is by the brilliant Helen Fry. Ladies and gentlemen, girls and boys, and whatever else this morning, go onto our TRE bookstore, click on the front cover, and it'll be winging its way to you. Helen, as always, you're one of my favourite guests. You explain so lyrically and beautifully. Helen Fry, thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you.